They said it would connect the world. Instead, it's collapsing, literally. November 2024, a concrete canopy crashes down at a railway station in Serbia, killing 16 people. The renovation was part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the trillion-dollar project that was supposed to reshape global trade. December 2023, Italy officially withdraws from the BRI, calling it a big mistake. The only G7 nation to join becomes the first to quit. January 2024, protesters flood the streets of Gwadar, Pakistan, demanding Chinese companies leave their port city. This isn't what Xi Jinping envisioned when he launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Back then, it was hailed as the project of the century, a new Silk Road that would lift entire continents out of poverty and cement China's role as a global superpower. But today, the BRI is crumbling faster than those Chinese-built projects themselves. In 2024, Chinese BRI engagement reached record highs of over $70 billion. Yet the initiative is facing unprecedented challenges. Countries are defaulting, projects are stalling, and Beijing's grand vision is turning into a geopolitical nightmare. From debt traps in Sri Lanka to corruption scandals in Ecuador, we're about to expose the shocking truth behind China's trillion-dollar gamble and why it's become one of the most humiliating foreign policy disasters in modern history. Because what we're about to discover will change how you see China's global ambitions forever. To understand how spectacularly the BRI has failed, we need to go back to the beginning, to 2013, when Xi Jinping stood before the world and painted a picture of unprecedented global cooperation. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just another infrastructure program. It was Xi's signature project, his bid to position China as the benevolent leader of a new world order. The plan was breathtaking in scope. Between 140 and 150 countries would participate, representing almost 75% of the world's population and more than half of global GDP. Beijing promised highways slicing through mountains, railways linking continents, and deep sea ports transforming remote coastlines into global trade hubs. Since its establishment in 2013, cumulative BRI engagement reached $1.175 trillion, with about $704 billion in construction contracts and $470 billion in non-financial investments. The timing seemed perfect. Across the developing world, countries desperately needed infrastructure but couldn't secure funding from traditional sources. Western banks saw too much risk. China saw an opportunity. For poor nations, it looked like a miracle. Finally, someone was offering them the roads, ports, and power plants they needed to join the modern economy. No lengthy approval processes, no complex conditions, just Chinese money, Chinese workers, and Chinese promises of prosperity. The early years were intoxicating. High-speed rail lines transformed travel times across Southeast Asia. Modern ports in Africa began handling international shipping. In Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor promised to revolutionize the entire region with $60 billion in investment. Xi Jinping basked in the global praise. Here was proof that China's rise could benefit everyone, a stark contrast to America's military interventions and Europe's colonial legacy. But beneath the ribbon-cutting ceremonies and glowing headlines, warning signs were already emerging. Local communities weren't benefiting from these mega-projects. Environmental damage was widespread. And most troubling of all, the debt was piling up faster than anyone had anticipated. Still, China pressed ahead. The BRI had become too big to fail, or so Beijing thought. What they didn't realize was that they were building the foundations of their own humiliation. The first cracks in China's grand vision appeared in the most dramatic way possible. Countries started surrendering their sovereignty. Sri Lanka became the poster child for what critics called debt trap diplomacy. Between 2007 and 2012, Sri Lanka secured loans worth over $1 billion from China's Exim Bank to finance the construction of Hambantota Port, despite widespread doubts about the project's profitability. The port was doomed from the start. Sri Lanka initially approached other potential creditors, including India and the Asian Development Bank, but failed to secure financing due to concerns over the port's viability. Ultimately, the Rajapaksa government turned to China, which offered loans at significantly higher interest rates, around 6.3%, compared to the 3% the ADB would have charged. When the port failed to generate revenue and Sri Lanka couldn't service its debts, Beijing made an offer Colombo couldn't refuse: hand over the port for 99 years in exchange for debt relief. China would cancel $1.1 billion off Sri Lanka's debt to China in exchange for the port. But Sri Lanka wasn't alone in this nightmare. Zambia tells an even more devastating story. Once hailed as one of Africa's success stories, Zambia borrowed billions from China for infrastructure projects. In 2020, Zambia became the first African country to default on its BRI loans. Chinese debt had grown to 43% of Zambia's national income, and when the country ran out of money, the fallout was severe. Inflation hit 16.5% in April 2025, and 5.8 million Zambians fell into food insecurity. The human cost was staggering. Families watched their savings evaporate as the currency collapsed. Children dropped out of school because their parents couldn't afford fees. Essential services were cut as the government struggled to pay even basic expenses. Pakistan's experience with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor reveals another layer of the BRI's failures. By 2022, CPEC had created only a fraction of the jobs promised, and Pakistan's debt repayment obligations to China are mounting. In the port city of Gwadar, there have been large protests against power and water shortages and the presence of Chinese companies, a growing backlash against China's multi-billion-dollar projects. Local fishermen found their livelihoods destroyed by Chinese trawlers, while promised development never materialized. But here's what makes this even more shocking. While these countries were drowning in debt, Chinese officials were getting rich off the chaos. In Montenegro, a tiny Balkan nation of just 620,000 people, China financed what would become one of the BRI's most embarrassing failures. Montenegro borrowed $1 billion, a third of its entire economy, to build a highway. That highway? It literally leads to nowhere. If you want to see the BRI's failures with your own eyes, Montenegro's Highway to Nowhere is the perfect place to start. China financed the first 41-kilometer segment of a highway through mountainous terrain at a cost of nearly $1 billion. When that initial stretch opened in 2022, it literally petered out in a rural field with no continuation. Montenegro's debt soared to 80% of GDP, and it can't afford to finish the road. Imagine borrowing a third of your country's entire economic output to build a road that goes nowhere. That's not infrastructure development. That's a monument to failed planning. But Montenegro's highway is just one of dozens of white elephant projects littering the BRI landscape. Sri Lanka's Madala Rajapaksa International Airport stands as perhaps the most absurd example. Billed as a second international gateway, it turned into the world's emptiest airport. Few flights land there, and it operates at a tiny fraction of capacity. The White Elephant Airport is so underused that wild elephants wander the empty runways. Think about that image for a moment. Wild elephants roaming freely through an international airport because there are no planes to disturb them. It's almost poetic, nature reclaiming a project that never should have existed. In Kenya, the Chinese-built railway from Nairobi to Mombasa has become a financial black hole. The railway ran into huge operating losses and was criticized for its high cost. Passengers struggled to afford tickets on a line that was supposed to boost economic growth. Environmental destruction has accompanied these infrastructure failures across the globe. In Indonesia, Chinese BRI investment fueled a nickel mining boom. Rainforests were clear-cut and ecosystems devastated to supply nickel for China's electric vehicle battery industry. The human cost has been equally devastating. Construction of railways and mines led to land grabs and displacement in countries like Pakistan and Laos. Promised jobs for locals often failed to materialize, as Chinese companies imported their own workers or the projects were ill-suited to local skills. In parts of Africa, Chinese-built hospitals remained empty because local staff was inadequately trained to run them. Imagine the cruel irony. new hospitals that can't treat patients because no one thought to train local doctors and nurses. But the corruption that enabled these disasters goes even deeper than anyone imagined. In Ecuador, engineers discovered something terrifying about the massive Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam, a $2.6 billion project hailed as a flagship BRI achievement. Engineers discovered 17,000 cracks in its structure. The dam, sitting at the foot of an active volcano, now operates at only partial capacity and is at risk of failure or collapse. How did this happen? Because Chinese contractors paid $76 million in bribes to Ecuadorian officials, reaching up to a former vice president, to secure the lucrative dam contract. Corners were cut, quality was ignored, and now an entire region lives under the threat of potential catastrophe. This wasn't development, it was exploitation disguised as partnership. By 2023, the cracks in China's Belt and Road Initiative had become impossible to hide. Countries that once eagerly welcomed Chinese investment were now scrambling to escape their BRI commitments. The most humiliating blow came from an unexpected source: Italy. Italy has withdrawn from China's Belt and Road Initiative more than 4 years after becoming the only group of 7 nations to sign up. For the past year, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has indicated that joining the BRI was a big mistake that she intended to correct by withdrawing from the initiative. The irony was devastating for Beijing. Italy wasn't some developing nation desperate for infrastructure. It was a founding member of NATO, the world's third largest economy in Europe and a key Western ally. When Italy joined the BRI in 2019, it was seen as a major diplomatic coup for China. Many Italian officials, including Minister of Foreign Affairs Antonio Tajani, stated that the BRI has not yielded the expected economic benefits for Italy. The 2019 agreement was set to expire in March 2024 with automatic renewal unless Rome provided 3 months written notice of withdrawal. What did Italy get from 4 years in the BRI? Virtually nothing. Italy's exports to China remain a very small share of total exports, while China's influence in Italian ports and infrastructure grew significantly. But Italy's exit was just the beginning of a global backlash. Malaysia launched corruption investigations into BRI projects, ultimately canceling 2 Chinese pipeline projects amid corruption investigations, and renegotiated the cost of a major rail link to nearly half the original price due to overpricing concerns. Myanmar froze the $3.6 billion Milestone Dam project after public protest and is renegotiating a proposed BRI deep sea port to avoid an unsustainable $7 billion debt. Sierra Leone canceled a $300 million Chinese airport deal in 2018, calling it unnecessary. Even Bangladesh and Nepal have withdrawn from certain BRI projects over debt and sovereignty worries. The numbers tell the story of China's retreat. Chinese overseas lending for BRI peaked around 2016 and then plummeted as many loans soured. In 2022, 60% of China's overseas lending went to borrowers in financial distress, compared to just 5% in 2010. The scale of the financial devastation is staggering. By 2023, at least a dozen countries were either in default or renegotiating Chinese debts. And extreme public debt driven by BRI has pushed several poor nations to the brink of bankruptcy. Beijing's loans often come with secret contract terms that prioritize Chinese repayment above other creditors, ensuring Beijing gets paid first even as host nations suffer austerity and instability. The BRI had become a global symbol not of Chinese generosity, but of Chinese exploitation. Behind every failed BRI project lies a web of corruption that makes the mafia look like amateur hour. The Democratic Republic of Congo reveals the true scale of Chinese corruption. Chinese state companies pledged $3 billion of roads and facilities in exchange for mining rights, but built less than $1 billion worth before stalling. Meanwhile, they paid $55 million in bribes to the then President Joseph Kabila's entourage to protect their interests. Malaysia witnessed one of the most brazen abuses. Former Prime Minister Najib Razak allegedly arranged inflated BRI projects to embezzle funds to cover up debts from the 1MDB corruption scandal. Chinese officials helped conceal the theft of as much as $1 billion via those projects. As the former president of China's Export-Import Bank put it, if the water is too clear, you don't catch any fish. Beijing's hands-off approach enabled unscrupulous officials to profit personally, creating high-profile, low-quality projects that left local populations paying the price through debt and poor services. While Beijing marked the BRI as green and sustainable, the environmental reality has been an ecological nightmare. China funded dozens of coal-fired power plants across Asia and Africa, locking countries into high-carbon energy. Even after Xi announced in 2021 that China would stop building coal plants abroad, projects already in the pipeline have continued. In January 2024, a 380 MW coal-fired power plant started operating in Sulawesi, Indonesia. The dam disasters reveal another layer of recklessness. Similar cracks have been reported in Chinese-built dams in Uganda and Pakistan, raising safety fears. In Myanmar, the planned Myitsone Dam would have flooded a huge area and displaced thousands. Often, local people bore the social costs while seeing few benefits. Faced with this mounting disaster, Beijing has been forced into an embarrassing retreat. But rather than admit failure, China has tried to rebrand the BRI as BRI 2.0, a supposedly more sustainable, responsible version of the original. The era of lavish mega projects, huge ports, cross-country railways, and giant highways is waning. Xi Jinping himself has been forced to change his rhetoric. At the 2023 forum, Xi Jinping told the participants that China will pursue high-quality, sustainable cooperation, a tacit admission that the earlier binge led to waste. The new strategy focuses on damage control. From 2020 to 2023, Beijing quietly negotiated dozens of debt rescheduling deals, for example, giving Zambia a grace period and longer maturity and temporarily suspending Sri Lanka's debt payments during its crisis. But even these relief efforts come with strings attached. China often drives a hard bargain, even in relief, insisting its loans be repaid first or in full, and sometimes asking for additional guarantees. Beijing has also tried to shift focus away from massive infrastructure toward digital projects and renewable energy. Rather than focus only on traditional infrastructure, steel and concrete, China is putting more emphasis on digital infrastructure, technology, and energy in BRI. This so-called digital Silk Road means installing fiber optic networks, data centers, telecom equipment, surveillance systems, and other high-tech projects in partner countries. China's energy-related engagement in 2024 was the greenest in absolute and relative terms in any period since the BRI's inception, reaching $11.8 billion, an increase of 60% compared to 2023. The BRI's collapse has triggered a complete realignment of global power dynamics that Beijing never saw coming. Meanwhile, Western powers have finally woken up to challenge China's infrastructure dominance. The United States and Europe have launched alternative initiatives. The G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, a $600 billion plan, and the EU's Global Gateway program both aim to offer transparent, high-standard infrastructure financing to developing countries. These programs promise to avoid the mistakes of BRI by providing grants or low-interest loans with safeguards, anti-corruption, environmental standards. But critics note they are late to the game. China spent a decade and over $1 trillion building relationships across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, while Western efforts are just ramping up. China's BRI has also pushed countries into new camps. As Russia became isolated due to its war in Ukraine, Moscow leaned heavily towards Beijing. The two have talked up linking Russia's Eurasian Economic Union infrastructure plans with the new BRI. New rail lines and pipelines are being developed from Russia to China, creating an economic alliance that could challenge American dominance for decades. This strengthening Sino-Russian axis, partially facilitated by BRI connectivity, is one factor fueling talk of a new Cold War dividing the world. But the geopolitical damage to China's reputation may be irreversible. At the 10-year mark of BRI celebrated in Beijing in October 2023, fewer foreign leaders showed up than China hoped. Many Western-aligned leaders stayed away, especially after China's no-limits friendship with Russia during the Ukraine war made BRI look politically charged. Vladimir Putin was an honored guest at the forum, underlining the emerging BRI alignment with anti-Western partners. But that only deepened skepticism elsewhere. The BRI has become a symbol not of China's rise, but of its overreach. After a decade and over $1 trillion, the Belt and Road Initiative stands as one of the most spectacular foreign policy failures in modern history. The numbers are damning. In 2023, China's policy banks only committed to lending $4.6 billion to African countries versus a commitment of $16.2 billion in 2018. FDI flows to all countries declined from a peak of $196 billion in 2016 to $177 billion in 2023, according to Economics Observatory. But the scale of the crisis goes beyond just declining investment. There has been a rise in emergency rescue lending for those countries whose financial stability was affected by the pandemic. In the last decade, there has been a retrenchment of China's overseas lending, as well as a slowdown of its investment, driven by domestic and external factors. China has had to commit more money to the project, expose itself to further risk, and has had to become entangled in complex local politics. For China itself, a report from Fitch Ratings doubts Chinese banks' ability to control risks, as they do not have a good record of allocating resources efficiently at home. What went wrong? The BRI collapsed because it was never really about development. It was all about control. Beijing designed the BRI to serve China's interest first, exporting excess industrial capacity, securing access to raw materials, and expanding geopolitical influence. The needs of partner countries were secondary considerations at best. The corruption was systematic and widespread. Beijing's policy banks and state firms often negotiated BRI loans in secret with local elites without open bidding or public oversight. This opacity was by design. Chinese lenders rarely disclosed loan terms, and host government officials often found it convenient to bypass accountability. The environmental and social costs were ignored. Projects were rushed through without proper environmental impact assessments or community consultation. Local populations bore the cost, while elites captured the benefits. Most fundamentally, the BRI failed because it was built on an obsolete model of development, one where rich countries impose grand plans on poor countries without genuine partnership or accountability. Behind every failed BRI project are real people whose lives have been shattered by China's broken promises. In Central Asia, collective debt to Beijing reached $15.7 billion by 2023, representing 7.6% of the region's external debt. Kazakhstan alone owes $9.2 billion as of January 1, 2024, primarily to China's Export-Import Bank, Exim Bank. The social consequences have been devastating. In 2018, over 30,000 Chinese migrants arrived in Kyrgyzstan for BRI projects, leading to rising anti-Chinese sentiments. Families have watched traditional livelihoods disappear as Chinese companies move in, while fishing communities have seen their catch diminish as Chinese operations pollute waterways. As one observer wryly noted, the BRI often built highways to nowhere in the developing world, illustrating how poorly conceived projects can fail spectacularly. The broader implications are profound. China's reputation as a responsible global power has been severely damaged. Developing countries have learned hard lessons about the risks of dependence on any single creditor, and the international community has been forced to develop alternatives to Chinese financing. In 2024, China's trade volume with partner countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, grew by 6.4% year-on-year, accounting for over half of China's total trade volume for the first time, according to China Digital Times. But this masks the reality that many of these relationships are now transactional rather than strategic. The BRI was supposed to be Xi Jinping's signature achievement, the project that would define his legacy and cement China's status as a global superpower. Instead, it has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the limits of authoritarian development models. The initiative has also revealed the fundamental incompatibility between China's authoritarian governance model and the transparent, accountable development that poor countries actually need. While China can build infrastructure quickly, it struggles with governance reforms and institutional strengthening that make development sustainable. Today, the BRI stands at a crossroads. Chinese Premier Li Qiang recently urged the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to increase support for the initiative, showing China is doubling down rather than stepping back. We do expect Chinese BRI engagement to reach similar levels in 2025 as in 2024, driven by growing needs of China's domestic players to invest abroad. But the world has learned hard lessons. Countries are more cautious, Western alternatives are emerging, and the age of uncritical acceptance of Chinese infrastructure finance is over. The trillion-dollar question now is whether Beijing can learn from these failures, or whether it'll double down on the very approaches that led to this humiliating collapse. What do you think? Can China salvage the Belt and Road Initiative, or is this the beginning of the end for Beijing's global infrastructure dreams? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this deep dive into one of the biggest geopolitical disasters of our time eye-opening, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're just getting started on exposing the stories that shape our world. The Belt and Road Initiative promised to connect the world. Instead, it revealed the true cost of China's global ambitions, and that cost $1 trillion and counting.